A man sits at a crowded table, laughter echoing around him. Plates clink, conversations overlap, the air is alive with warmth. Yet he feels like he's watching from the outside. He smiles when he's supposed to, nods at the right moments, but there's a quiet distance he can't close. It's as if there's a pane of glass between him and the rest of the world. Everyone else seems content with the surface of things, while he keeps sinking beneath them. Intelligence has its own gravity. It pulls you inward, into patterns, into questions, into depths that others often don't even notice. And that gravity can feel isolating. You see the irony in jokes that others miss. You catch contradictions in conversations that no one else seems to hear. You notice the way people hide behind small talk, but you can't bring yourself to fully join in. The very thing that sharpens your mind can dull your sense of belonging. Maybe you felt it. Sitting in a group, your thoughts moving faster than your mouth, holding back because explaining them would take too long. Or listening to someone pour out a belief you know is full of holes, but you don't want to shatter their comfort with your analysis. So you stay silent, you smile, you let them believe, and later you wonder why your silence feels heavier than speaking ever would. Psychologists sometimes call this the curse of knowledge. Once you see a layer of complexity, you can't unsee it, and that makes it harder to relate to those who live comfortably on the surface. You long for connection, but connection often demands simplicity. And simplicity feels dishonest. That's the paradox. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that the crowd is untruth. He meant that when people gather, they settle for the lowest common denominator. Easy phrases, shallow agreements, the kind of talk that doesn't require much of anyone. For someone who thinks deeply, that crowd can feel suffocating. Not because you don't want to belong, but because belonging seems to require that you amputate parts of yourself. But here's the thing, the hunger for belonging never goes away. No matter how sharp your mind, no matter how much you pride yourself on independence, there's still that human pull toward being understood, being seen. You want someone who doesn't just hear your words, but grasps the weight beneath them. Someone who sees not just your cleverness, but your loneliness too. And maybe that's what makes this paradox so sharp, because the smarter you are, the more clearly you can see the gap between the connection you crave and the one you're offered. You notice when conversations skim across the surface. You feel the dissonance when people bond over things you can't bring yourself to care about. And even as you try to bridge that gap, there's a part of you that whispers, "This isn't real, this isn't enough." That whisper can grow into cynicism, into withdrawal. You start thinking it's better to be alone than to pretend. Better to retreat into books or analysis or private thoughts than to keep failing at shallow connections. And on some level, you convince yourself that's strength. That solitude proves your independence. But at night, when the house is quiet, when the distractions fade, the other voice emerges. The one that admits you're tired of carrying everything in your own head. The one that aches for someone who doesn't need you to simplify yourself. The one that wonders, is intelligence a gift or a wall I keep building higher? That's where the paradox lives. Intelligence expands your vision, but it also sharpens the edges of your isolation. It gives you insight into the world, but that insight can make the world feel unbearably far away. And yet, beneath the distance, there's still that longing. The quiet hope that somewhere, someone can meet you where you are, not despite your depth, but because of it. Think about how early it begins. As a child, maybe you noticed details others brushed past. While kids laughed at the cartoon, you were wondering why the character made that decision in the first place. While others accepted rules without question, you asked why. Teachers praised your curiosity, but peers often rolled their eyes. You weren't trying to be difficult. You just couldn't stop seeing angles they didn't. That small gap widens as you grow. Friendships form around shared tastes, shared rhythms. But when your rhythm runs deeper, more tangled, it can feel like you're always half a beat off. You sit with friends who are excited about gossip, or trends, or the newest distraction, and you wonder why it leaves you hollow. You want to care. You even pretend sometimes, but pretending drains you more than silence ever could. This is where the paradox sharpens, because intelligence doesn't just make you different in how you think. It shapes how you feel connection. For many, belonging is found in ease, familiar jokes, shared rituals, unspoken agreements to not dig too deep. But you crave resonance, the click of someone's mind matching yours, the thrill of being challenged, the relief of being fully seen. And that kind of connection is rare. Psychologist Abraham Maslow wrote about peak experiences, those moments of intense clarity, unity, or awe. Highly intelligent people often hunger for connection that feels like that. Something more than nods and small talk, something that shakes the walls of isolation. But when the world offers you surface-level exchanges instead, the gap becomes almost unbearable. And yet, there's a hidden cost to that hunger, because the more you long for rare, profound connection, the harder it becomes to appreciate the ordinary. A coffee with a friend, laughter over something silly. They can feel like crumbs when what you're starving for is a feast. That mindset, though, is a trap. It keeps you circling the same thought. No one really gets me. And the more you tell yourself that, the more isolated you become. There's another piece here too, the pressure of identity. If you've been labeled the smart one for most of your life, it can feel like you're not allowed to just be human. People come to you for answers, not vulnerability. They admire your insights but rarely ask about your fears. They laugh at your cleverness but don't always sit with your pain. And so the role becomes a mask, one that's hard to take off, even when you desperately want to. You may even feel guilt for longing at all. After all, intelligence brings advantages. Problem solving, creativity, the ability to see what others miss. Shouldn't that be enough? Shouldn't that compensate for loneliness? But it doesn't. Because intelligence doesn't erase the most basic human need. To belong. To be understood without translating yourself. To be loved without shrinking yourself. You may even feel guilt for longing at all. After all, intelligence brings advantages. Problem solving, creativity, the ability to see what others miss. Shouldn't that be enough? Shouldn't that compensate for loneliness? But it doesn't. Because intelligence doesn't erase the most basic human need. To belong. To be understood without translating yourself. To be loved without shrinking yourself. This is why so many intelligent people end up stuck in an unspoken cycle. Withdrawing when connection feels shallow, yearning when withdrawal becomes empty, returning with hope, and retreating again when the cycle repeats. You tell yourself you're fine alone, but loneliness leaks through in moments you didn't expect. You scroll endlessly, hoping to stumble into resonance. You replay conversations in your head, wishing you had said less or more. You dream of someone asking the question that unlocks everything you've kept inside. The paradox isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. It's waking up each day torn between the safety of solitude and the ache of belonging. It's being proud of your independence while quietly envying those who can laugh freely, bond easily, and seem unbothered by the gaps you can't stop noticing. And yet, despite the weight, despite the longing, intelligence also holds the seed of possibility. Because if you can see the paradox, you can also see its patterns. You can notice when you're closing yourself off, when cynicism is disguising hunger, when the mask of independence is really just loneliness in another costume. That's where things begin to shift, not by pretending you don't feel disconnected, but by learning how to live with the paradox itself. When you carry this paradox long enough, it seeps into how you see yourself. You begin to wonder if maybe you were built to be separate, that solitude is simply the cost of awareness, and in some ways, that belief can feel like a kind of armor. I don't need anyone, you tell yourself. I'm fine alone. But the armor grows heavy, because no matter how much you try to convince yourself otherwise, identity is always relational. You know who you are in part because of how others mirror you. When that mirror is distorted, when people only reflect back fragments of your intelligence without the fullness of your humanity, you start to feel like a ghost in your own life, seen but not known. Relationships become the sharpest edge of the paradox. With friends, you may find yourself torn between honesty and harmony. Do you say what you really think and risk the silence that follows? Or do you smooth it over and leave with the quiet ache of inauthenticity? Neither choice feels right, so you hover in between, half present, half guarded. In love, the tension deepens. Intimacy requires vulnerability, but vulnerability often feels unsafe when your mind runs 10 steps ahead. You analyze before you open up, predict before you trust, anticipate rejection before it arrives. And yet, part of you longs to let go of that vigilance, to feel the rare freedom of being fully understood without effort. The paradox turns every gesture of closeness into a test. Will they truly see me, or will I have to shrink again? Even in family where belonging is supposed to be automatic, intelligence can create distance. Maybe you've sat at a dinner table biting your tongue as relatives trade opinions you know are shallow or flawed. Maybe you've been told to stop overthinking or lighten up, as if curiosity itself were a burden. Over time, those small dismissals add up. They teach you to hide the parts of yourself that don't fit, even in the places where you most crave acceptance. The cruel part is that intelligence makes you aware of this cycle. You notice not only the gap between you and others, but also the way you contribute to it. You see yourself withdrawing, rolling your eyes internally, choosing silence over small talk. You know you're building walls, but knowing doesn't always make it easier to stop. Awareness without relief becomes its own kind of torment. But here's a shift worth holding on to. The paradox of intelligence isn't a permanent prison. It's more like a terrain you have to learn to navigate. The walls you feel aren't made of stone, they're made of perception. And perception, though stubborn, is malleable. For example, think about the way you interpret disconnection. When you're in a group and you feel that sense of distance, your mind frames it as a failure. I don't belong here. But what if that same distance is also evidence of uniqueness? What if the ache of not fitting in isn't proof of brokenness, but proof that your lens is sharper, wider, more nuanced? Seen from that angle, the loneliness carries a different weight. Not easier, maybe, but less suffocating. Psychologists sometimes talk about reframing, shifting the meaning of an experience without changing the experience itself. That doesn't erase the paradox, but it changes how you carry it. Instead of seeing your intelligence as a wall, you can begin to see it as a filter. Yes, it filters out some connections, but it also filters toward the rare ones that matter. The people who can meet you in the depths, who can challenge and resonate instead of just skim. This doesn't mean settling for shallow connections is the answer. It means accepting that the search may take longer, and that solitude in the meantime isn't proof of failure. It's the space where you hold out for resonance. Of course, this kind of reframing isn't easy. When the loneliness feels raw, philosophical shifts don't erase the sting, but they do plant seeds. The possibility that you aren't as alone as your mind convinces you. That the paradox of intelligence isn't a curse, but a path. A harder path, yes, but one that shapes you into someone capable of deeper, rarer bonds than most people ever experience. There's a story of a lighthouse standing on a cliff. To the villagers below, it seemed lonely, a single tower against the dark sea. But to the ships navigating rough waters, that same light was life itself. That's what intelligence can feel like. From the outside, it may look isolating, but to those who can recognize its glow, it becomes a beacon. The paradox shifts when you realize your difference isn't just distance, it's signal. That shift begins in small ways, like learning to sit with silence without letting it spiral into despair, or allowing yourself to engage in surface-level conversations without expecting them to carry the weight of your existence. Sometimes belonging isn't found in perfect resonance, but in shared humanity. A laugh over something trivial, a moment of kindness exchanged without words. These fragments don't erase your longing for depth, but they can soften the edges of loneliness. And in those softer spaces, something else emerges. Patience. The recognition that rare connections take time, that not every person is meant to see you fully. And that's not failure, it's filtering. You're not meant to belong everywhere. You're meant to belong somewhere, with someone, with a few who can meet you not just at the surface, but in the depths you carry. Think of the philosophers, artists, and thinkers whose work still echoes centuries later. Many of them felt the same isolation. Nietzsche wandering the mountains alone, Emily Dickinson writing from her room in near silence, Kafka convinced he was unreadable. Their intelligence made them outsiders in their time, yet it was that very distance that allowed them to shape something enduring. Loneliness sharpened their vision, and while that doesn't make it easy, it shows the paradox isn't only a wound, it's also a well. A source of perspective, of depth, of truth that others may not see until much later. But let's not romanticize it too much. The ache of disconnection is real and sometimes unbearable. What makes it livable is the way you learn to hold it. When you stop demanding that every interaction validate your depth, you give yourself room to breathe. When you let go of the fantasy that one perfect person will dissolve your loneliness entirely, you open yourself to imperfect, yet meaningful bonds. Because here's the quiet irony. Belonging doesn't always come from finding someone who matches you thought for thought. Sometimes it comes from finding someone who doesn't, but who still chooses to stay. The friend who can't follow every leap of your mind, but listens anyway. The partner who doesn't analyze everything the way you do, but still grounds you when your thoughts spiral. Belonging isn't always about perfect mirrors. Sometimes it's about steady hands that don't let go. And maybe that's the heart of the paradox. You long for depth, but you also need breadth. Depth gives you meaning. Breadth gives you connection. Too much of one without the other leaves you hollow. Intelligence pulls you toward the deep end, but humanity requires you to wade back to the shallow waters sometimes. Not because they're enough, but because they're part of the whole. This doesn't mean betraying yourself. It means learning flexibility, knowing when to dive into analysis and when to let a simple laugh be enough, knowing when solitude heals and when it hardens into isolation, knowing that belonging doesn't erase difference, it weaves difference into something shared. In this way, the paradox of intelligence becomes less of a curse and more of a practice, a lifelong balancing act between honoring your depth and allowing the world in all its simplicity to still matter. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a forest at night. Behind you is the village, warm lights, familiar sounds, easy comfort. In front of you, the darkness, uncertain, quiet, and endless. Most people stay near the village, but you're drawn to the forest, not because you want to be alone, but because you can't ignore the call of what lies beyond. Intelligence feels like that, a pull toward deeper questions, sharper truths, unlit paths. And yes, the forest can be lonely. The silence heavy, but every so often you stumble on a clearing where someone else has lit a fire, a fellow wanderer, a mind that echoes your own in surprising ways. Those moments are rare, but they're real, and when they come, you understand something vital. The forest wasn't empty after all. The paradox of intelligence isn't about choosing between depth and belonging. It's about learning to carry both, to accept that your mind will often walk paths others don't, and that this difference will sometimes set you apart. But also to remember that belonging doesn't vanish just because it's harder to find. It waits in unexpected places, in fragments of laughter, in imperfect hands, in those rare fires burning in the dark. Maybe the real challenge isn't solving the paradox, but learning to live inside it, to honor your solitude without letting it calcify into isolation, to cherish rare resonance when it appears, without dismissing the quieter bonds along the way, to allow your intelligence to illuminate, not just distance. Because at the end of the day, intelligence doesn't erase your humanity. You still long, you still ache, you still need, and in that, you're not so different after all. The very thing that sets you apart also ties you back to the same hunger for connection that everyone carries, whether they admit it or not. So the next time you feel that invisible glass between you and the rest of the world, pause, breathe. Remember, the glass is not unbreakable. Sometimes it's as fragile as the courage to speak honestly, or as simple as letting yourself laugh even when the joke doesn't matter. Sometimes it's choosing to stay present, even in the shallow water, until you find your way back to the depths. And maybe that's where belonging hides, not in solving the paradox, but in embracing it, in realizing that to feel disconnected is proof you're alive to something more, that your longing is not weakness, it's direction, a compass pointing toward the rare places, the rare people who can meet you in both silence and speech. In the end, the paradox of intelligence is not just about being different. It's about carrying both distance and desire in the same heart, about being the lighthouse, alone on the cliff, yes, but shining for those who need to see.